Chapter 3, Ain't I a Violent Person? Understanding Girl Fighters. I really know how to fight. So I really would beat her up, real bad, and then leave her there. That would be the end of that. Delisha, 17. I am on my way to Delisha's house on another hot summer day. Staring out the car window, I notice several men hanging out on a stoop near the corner. Graffiti on the wall behind the group reads, J Block. This letter block combination is familiar. It makes me think of the stories I have been hearing this summer from men incarcerated in the maximum security prison outside of the city. I have been visiting the prison, along with a half-dozen other university students, for a weekly introductory criminal justice course offered as part of the Inside Out Prison Exchange program. Several of my incarcerated classmates have shared stories about growing up in neighborhoods just like Delisha's. They talk about the blocks they used to live on, 29th Street, 34th Street, 46th Street, and the blocks they live on now, A Block, D Block, J Block. J Block, they say, is one of the prison's most chaotic areas. The porous boundaries between the street and the prison are always there, but the connections are not usually so obvious. Delisha's block stands out to me for this reason. 17-year-old Delisha and her young daughter live in a row home with her grandmother, who raised her, her two brothers, and Delisha's aunt. When I first meet Delisha, I notice how different her demeanor is from that of girls like Takea or Danielle. Those girls work to blend in. They do not want to draw the attention of anyone looking to prove a point. Delisha, on the other hand, seems to seek, even demand attention. She is polite as she invites me and my companion, a young male medical school student who is along for the visit, into her home, but she is not smiling, and her eyes do not drift away from ours. She looks us in the face. Delisha takes up space. Like other girls I interviewed, Delisha sees life as a struggle, and she is determined to come out on top. Delisha is the sort of young, black woman who troubles even the most well-intentioned middle-class people, white or black, when they encounter girls like her behind the counter at a city drugstore or on the commuter train. She has attitude written all over her face. I've never had anything handed to me on a silver plate, like everybody else did, or however else it happened. But I love to struggle, she tells me during the course of our conversation. Delisha seems to relish confronting her life's daily battles head-on, an attitude towards life that she takes literally. Early in our conversation, she states with confidence and without apology that she has always been all about fighting. Was this the first time something like this happened to you? I ask, referring to the wound she received during her fight with a neighborhood girl. Yup. This was the first fight you got into? I question. First fight with her? Delisha asks. First fight, in general. Oh, no, Delisha replies with a smile. No. I question. Oh, no, she repeats. How often did you fight before you got into this fight? I ask. 2nd grade to the 10th. To the 10th? I probe, hoping for more information. Every school I went to was all about me fighting, Delisha explains. Then, in a way that reinforces her tough demeanor, she continues, every school, from elementary, to middle school, to junior high, to high school. In contrast to girls who are reluctant to fight, and do so only when they feel they have to, Delisha represents herself as committed to a fighting career. Her claim to be all about fighting defies common expectations about girls' behavior. Violence is generally considered femininity's polar opposite. Yet, as much as Delisha's disclosure challenges what we currently believe to be true about violence and about girls, I found that her tone, demeanor, and perspective were quite typical of a significant segment of the girls I encountered and interviewed. These girls who fight and win regularly, whom I describe as girl fighters, make sense of their struggle to survive in today's inner city by becoming all about fighting. Girl fighters, like their good girl counterparts, must make choices and take chances as they pursue the intersecting survival and gender projects in today's inner city. This chapter examines these decisions, and the conditions under which they are made, in order to understand how and why a girl like Delisha becomes a fighter. Why does she invest so deeply in crafting an identity that places her so far outside both mainstream and local expectations of femininity? This chapter offers a contrast to the experiences of good girls who work to meet the expectations of appropriate femininity that are reflected in the image of the Black lady. Similarities and differences in the beliefs and behaviors of girl fighters, who are more likely to be evaluated by others as ghetto, are revealed when juxtaposed with the life experiences of the good girls described in the previous chapter. Girl fighters craft a somewhat defiant presentation of self that emerges from the isolation, frustration, and anger that poor, Black girls internalize early in their lives. Both good girls and girl fighters are invested in what they think of as the struggle. But the good girl's accomplishment of survival depends more heavily on her investment in a gendered identity that deviates only slightly from mainstream expectations of appropriate femininity and is generally consistent with notions of a respectable Black femininity. In contrast, girls who craft a fighter persona directly challenge the relatively restrictive and potentially dangerous expectations of appropriate femininity in this setting. A girl's reputation as a fighter may protect her from certain challenges and allows her certain freedoms, while also making her more vulnerable to retaliatory actions that range from nonverbal looks and stares to life-threatening assaults. The narratives of the teenaged girls I interviewed reveal two common pathways to becoming a fighter. I describe these in the next section. I then critically consider why a girl might embrace an identity that distances her from what is commonly understood as gender-appropriate and respectable behavior. I ground this discussion with an extended narrative that focuses on Terry, a high school junior who describes herself as a violent person. I conclude the chapter by considering some long-term implications of the ways in which gender works at the intersections of race and class to keep girls in their place. What does the future look like for a young Black girl who visibly challenges such restrictive expectations in her day-to-day life? Do girls like Delisha forfeit forever any claim to traditional expectations of femininity? Will they always live by the code of the street? Can they ever become something other than a fighter? If so, how? Real boys, good girls, and girl fighters. In American society, as in most others, gender lessons begin in early childhood. Boys learn early on that aggression and dominance are fundamental elements of manhood. Family members will directly or indirectly encourage aggressive behavior in boys while discouraging it in girls in ways that make aggression seem natural or essential to being a boy. Girls, meanwhile, are encouraged not to be like boys. They are taught at an early age to restrain their anger and physical aggression. How, then, do girls like Delisha craft their reputations as fighters, and how do they reconcile the gendered contradictions that emerge when a girl fights like a boy? In many ways, the process of crafting a public persona as a fighter is not unlike what boys do to convince others that they can go for bad or that they are badasses, nor is it especially different from what girls like Danielle do to convince others that they are good. What good girls and girl fighters have in common is, first, a shared structural cultural context that is shaped profoundly by entrenched poverty, the threat of violence in everyday life, and by the code of the street. This shared context leads to a preoccupation with survival, including a conscious and active imagining of what to do next in order to ensure personal safety. The intersecting and overlapping aspects of inner-city girls' identities, poor, young, Black, and female, put them in an especially vulnerable position. Some popular media images and songs reinforce cultural lessons about the value of being a tough, strong, and independent girl. Teenaged girls do hear songs about men who need a woman who is ready to physically battle with others, called a ride or die bitch in one song, if and when necessary. Such representations of Black women provide a newly defiant image of Black femininity that is rooted in the same type of physicality that characterizes the experience of the young, urban male. These cultural messages also reinforce the survival lessons that are passed along to young women from family members and peers. At the intersection of these messages and media images, the tough girl who fights and wins emerges as a possible identity. Some teenaged inner-city girls may already sense that being perceived by others as a good girl is somehow beyond them. Their hair may be the wrong texture, their demeanor may be too loud. Since violations of gender expectations such as these frequently result in formal and informal sanctions, girls with these attributes also may have earlier and more frequent opportunities to acquire and hone fighting skills. In this structural cultural context, the good girls come to believe that their best chance for survival lies in staying close to home and meeting general and gendered expectations in school. Staying out of trouble is key to survival for these girls. In contrast, girls with reputations as fighters come to rely not on their looks but on what they can do. These girls learn to value agency over passivity and strength over weakness. Because their everyday environment is one saturated with messages about the fragility of personal safety, girl fighters come to take a special sort of pride in their ability to fight and win. Becoming a fighter. There are, no doubt, many ways in which girls go about constructing their identities as fighters. Among the girls I interviewed, two routes emerged as most common. The first pathway opens spontaneously, during unsupervised play with other kids in the neighborhood. In this kind of setting, when a girl gets into a fight, the response from her peers is largely unmediated by adults. This makes it possible for a girl to craft an identity that contradicts normative expectations of gender without having to fear serious sanctions from adults, and with the significant benefit of building self-confidence. An elementary school-aged girl who knows how to fight and win gains a special status position among her peer group, one that enables her to subvert efforts by family members, school personnel, and some peers to shape her behavior in gender-appropriate ways. The second potential pathway to becoming a fighter typically develops later, is more deliberate, and involves the intervention of at least one family member. Because danger is an acknowledged aspect of inner-city life, some families choose to protect young members by passing along defensive skills to both boys and girls. A young girl's male family members may teach her how to fight in response to an actual or a perceived moment of vulnerability. Each pathway transmits cultural lessons about the importance of strength and toughness. These lessons alone, however, are not enough for a girl to become a fighter. Embracing that identity involves at least 3 steps. A girl fighter prioritizes individual assertiveness over perceived weakness, learns the necessary skills to make her an able fighter, and is gratified by the feelings associated with fighting and winning. This third aspect is perhaps the most significant of the early gender violations performed by the girl fighter. A good girl does not like hurting other people. In contrast, the girl fighter embraces this feeling, and in doing so, she directly challenges the constraints that other girls seem to submit to more willingly. She comes to believe that she is better than other girls, perhaps especially the good or pretty ones. This sentiment encourages a greater sense of self-confidence, which gives the girl who fights a significant advantage in self-preservation. Adolescence is a time when most girls grow less self-confident and begin to internalize the negative stereotypes associated with women and girls. By the time a girl reaches high school, she is experienced in trading on her carefully crafted front as a tough girl who can box, fight with her hands, a person others should be wary of challenging. High school, however, also introduces a new arena, one that requires girls to re-establish their reputations. Courting conflict, looks, bumps, stares, and the fight. Typically, girls who know how to fight are far more confident in handling potentially aggressive situations than girls who have never fought. Girls do not have to be highly skilled fighters relative to boys. They will stand out as fighters because most girls do not invest time in learning how to fight. Since fights do not happen every day, girls who are truly committed to crafting a fighter identity must court conflict by engaging in strategic campaigns for respect in order to create the types of interactions that will reaffirm their position. Here, too, they violate normative expectations of femininity. Good girls do not court conflict, they avoid it. A girl fighter courts conflict using the same arsenal of interpersonal micro-assaults her male peers use: looks, stares, and bumps. Being a fighter requires that a girl not only maintain a tough front over an extended period of time, but also that she actually fight when a non-negotiable point of confrontation is reached. Like the badass, she must always be open to challenge and she must never fail any challenge. There is no time off for the girl who has committed herself to becoming a fighter. She must be, as Delisha says, all about fighting. The moment of dramatic realization, the fight, is brief, fleeting even, especially relative to all the time and effort invested prior to that moment. Still, it is necessary. For girls, no less than for boys, the fight provides the opportunity to prove one's reputation to a larger network of others. The high school fight is particularly useful in shaping this public persona precisely because most fights are gratifyingly messy and short spectacles. Students, who tend to know how long it will take school security officers to arrive on the scene, will begin to break up a fight before these adult authorities arrive. The evaluation of the fight, its winners and losers, begins as soon as the fight ends. The group of onlookers is transformed into a network of interpreters who collectively ask and answer questions about who won. Without the audience, the fight has no meaning. The collective answer the group reaches has serious consequences. The group's interpretation of a fighter's performance not only determines whether or not a girl retains her status as a fighter, it also can shape what happens next, including whether or not escalation or retaliation is necessary. The uses of aggression and violence. By the time a girl is known as a fighter, she has embraced an identity that directly contradicts expectations of normative femininity, which bear heavily upon her life. She stands in contrast to general depictions of femininity as well as locally defined notions of respectable black femininity. She is not passive or submissive. She does not easily defer to power or authority. She is not a good girl in the minds of others. She is an outsider. Such an identity is protective, but at the same time, it can make a fighter more vulnerable to challenges from others who are trying to prove a point as they craft their own fighter identities. Girl fighters are also more vulnerable to sanctions for violating gender expectations. Their distinctly unladylike demeanor is likely to attract negative attention from school officials, for example, with the result that she is likely to receive harsher treatment when a real or imagined violation occurs. It is easier to punish the girl who does not act like a girl. Thus, being known as a fighter can simultaneously protect a teenaged girl and make her more vulnerable. In order to understand why some girls refuse to just go along with expectations of appropriate feminine behavior, we need to critically consider what benefits might be associated with not being a good girl, to understand what she gets from physical fights and her fighter persona in general. In the most basic sense, the girl who is known as a fighter gets what everyone wants and what most of us spend a good deal of time seeking: an identity. We all long to be somebody, and respect. While the respect of our peer group matters to most of us, in settings governed by the culture of the code, it takes on a critical importance. In settings that are governed by the code, respect that is based on strength and the potential for dominance matters not only to an individual's constantly developing sense of self, but also to her or his struggle for survival. Both young men and young women gain a sense of power or control over their lives when they take their survival into their own hands, figuratively and literally. This sense of power is especially important to those girls whose particular intersection of race, gender, and class make them more vulnerable than others. While the sort of power that is derived from the code is seemingly hypermasculine, based as it is on the coupling of physical strength with social dominance, it is not restricted to men only. The reality of this power is real, and the girl fighters' embrace of it as more than an act is revealed in girls' accounts of why they fight. These explanations often describe the catalyst for the transformation of anger or frustration into action as a desire to put right a perceived injustice that might otherwise be ignored. Charmaine, an 8th grader, explains that she uses her strength and power to challenge the gendered hierarchy in which she exists. "Why were you fighting this time?" I ask. "Because boys like to think that they can hit on girls, but they can't hit on me." "So why do you fight boys?" "Because I don't like to see boys hit girls." Charmaine explains that when she sees a boy hit a girl, she calls him on it. "Don't you know that you not supposed to hit no female?" That explicit and public challenge usually starts something that Charmaine is committed to finishing. In this case, Charmaine is using her power in a way that both challenges and reaffirms, reconstructs, even, the gendered hierarchy that initially positions her as powerless. She readily calls a boy out because he is not showing girls proper, gendered, respect. A boy does not hit a girl, the lesson goes, because girls are weaker than boys, yet Charmaine uses her strength, her physical strength, to challenge this assumption. She also uses her power to challenge the normalized degradation of girls, which occurs in the form of calling you out your name that adolescent boys, and girls, too, engage in at school. Plus, Charmaine continues, the boys at my school always want to call you out your name. Like what? I ask. Like bitch, slut. Do they just call you out your name, or other girls too? Like half the girls they do, but I don't like that. It be making me real angry. It is Charmaine's final comment that shifts our attention from what normalizes the use of physical violence, the culture of the code, to what helps fuel a young girl's commitment to crafting an outsider identity as powerful and volatile as a fighter, anger. Black feminist scholars have written about this anger over the last several decades, and the conditions in which African American, inner-city girls are coming of age have only worsened over time. The use of physical aggression or violence provides a way for girls like Charmaine and Delisha to express their anger, to intervene in the power dynamics that oppress them, and to try to make things right, on their own. Charmaine knows she can fight and win. She can, and therefore she does, physically intervene in order to avoid becoming either a hapless victim or a dismissive observer of the budding misogyny expressed by boys her age. In some ways, it may look like girls are simply posing or modeling the behavior of boys and men. Yet, such a cursory analysis overlooks the serious concerns at the heart of girls' battles, including concerns about respect. Failing to acknowledge the fact that girls too share these concerns about respect and reputation in a context where these things matter minimizes girls' lives. Rather than emerging as a thinking girl, a girl with agency, a girl who is actively trying to make sense of her social world and who she is in it, a girl who is determined to make it, a girl who fights and wins is typically portrayed as incomprehensible, decidedly deviant, or delinquent. But once we acknowledge that girls can and do take some satisfaction in the ability to take care of themselves, to defend themselves, to handle their own business, the next step, seeing girls like Delisha and Charmaine as something more than gender mimes, is easy. And that step, in turn, readies us to seriously consider the larger goals that may motivate girl fighters, the desire for space, mobility, and freedom. The good girl isolates herself from people and situations she considers dangerous, that is, those that pose a threat either to her physical well-being or to the preservation of her self-image as respectable or decent. From the fighter's perspective, the good girl is trapped, imprisoned by traditional and/or local notions of femininity and by a lack of physical skills. Nearly all of street life is off-limits to the good girl. Typically, we believe that it is the girl who is out on the street that is labeled as bad because she is on the street. However, the girl fighter presents us with a contradictory example. Because the girl fighter has the skills and the willingness to go for bad, she is able and eager to be in the street and to enjoy the freedom that she comes to associate with being in places that others, perhaps especially the good girls, consider dangerous. For a teenaged girl like Nneka, the respect, status, and self-esteem gained from being known as an able fighter provide the necessary freedom and security to pass the time casually on the block, and to walk the hallways of the high school with confidence. Nneka, who is in her early teens, often hangs out on the corner in her neighborhood until the late hours of the night. Although fights occasionally break out while she is there, she tells me that she never feels unsafe. Instead, she enjoys herself, relaxing and listening to others talk. I just be outside. Like having fun. I just be outside. Everybody be outside and I just be sitting there, like, laughing and listening to them. But they be like bustin' on each other and making jokes and stuff, or they just be talking about stuff. Thanks to past battles fought and won, Nneka can occupy more interesting places, including places that are considered male spaces and that are commonly perceived as too dangerous for teenaged girls, places like the corner. The price paid for this mobility and freedom is that the girl fighter sees herself as constantly involved in a battle. One indication of the intensity of this battle is the frequency with which fights are followed by a quest for retaliation. During interviews, the way girls describe the end of a fight often would reveal their plans for payback. Those who were satisfied with a fight's outcome usually closed their stories with something like "that was that," indicating that the fight was over and there was no plan for or expectation of retaliation. Sometimes, however, Payback was planned. When I spoke with Delisha about the fight in which she had been cut, her demeanor suggested that she judged the outcome of that encounter unsatisfactory. I asked about her plans for the future. "So, do you think you'll end up in a fight with her again?" "Yeah." "You do? Do you think you're going to end up?" Delisha interrupts, "Yeah, it's going to happen." "Yeah?" I question. "It's going to happen because I'm not going to let her keep saying what she wants to say to me. I'm not going to let her keep disrespecting me," she states firmly. I ask Delisha if there is a way she can avoid another fight with this girl. She replies with an explanation that first highlights how much of her social world is made up of public space. "We live in the same neighborhood. She lives around the corner from my house. She know the same people as I do. She goes to every basketball game. She walks around the neighborhood. People I know her. It's just, she works at Dwayne's, a neighborhood takeout. I go to eat at Dwayne's, so it's nothing that we can really stop from seeing each other. She goes to the same market. There's no other market around here, so she has to walk up the block. She has to walk past my house to get to the market. She doesn't have to walk past here to go to work. She can go any way to go to work, but she chooses to walk up this block, and she chooses to walk down this block, however way she chooses. But one day she's going to choose, and it's going to be the wrong decision. Whether they like it or not, these two girls' lives are close. Their worlds are made up of shared public space and overlapping networks of association. The everyday choices they make come with consequences. Delisha is not interested in investing in patterns of situational avoidance in order to avoid a potential conflict. Doing so would contradict fundamental beliefs she holds regarding her claim to freedom and mobility in her neighborhood. "I'm not looking over my shoulder for nobody. I walk the streets as though I know where I'm going and how I'm going to get there. Everybody and whatever happens on my way there is going to happen. That's one thing about me. I never be like, well, at a certain time, I'm not going to walk outside, at a certain time I'm not going to do this. No. If I've got somewhere to go and I need to get home and it's 2 in the morning, I'm going to go home. If that's where I want to be at 2 in the morning, or however time it take me to get there, that's where I'm going to go. I'm not a scared type to walk on the street at no time. I walk on the streets anytime I want to. I do anything I want to, anytime I want to do it. It's never been a problem walking on the street 3 o'clock in the morning. If I want to go home 3 o'clock in the morning, I'm going to go home. I'm not looking over my shoulder. My grandma never raised me to look over my shoulder. So, I'm not going to start because of a little incident that happened." Delisha's assertion that she does and will continue to do anything I want to, anytime I want to do it is especially striking given recent events in her immediate area. She lives in a neighborhood that was thrust onto the front pages of the city newspapers and local network news broadcasts when 7 dead bodies were found in what was believed to be a crack house, located around the corner from Delisha's home. This massacre was the largest in the city's history. Delisha's refusal to allow anyone else to define where she can and cannot go reveals a willingness to take responsibility for her own safety, even in a setting where violence occurs with a troubling regularity. Urban, adolescent girls who have fought and won repeatedly during the course of their adolescent years share Delisha's fierce desire to freely occupy the space outside their homes. If necessary, these girls will physically fight to maintain this sense of freedom. Terry's narrative, which I turn to in the next section, highlights the potential opportunities available to a girl fighter. Terry's story shows how girl fighters, like good girls, manipulate good and ghetto expectations in navigating the code of the street. Ain't I a violent person? Terry's story. When we first meet, Terry, who is just completing her junior year at a local public high school, is dressed in jean shorts and a white tank top. Her hair is neatly tied up under a silk scarf. She stands about 5 feet 8 inches and her well-built frame carries about 165 pounds. She has a dark chocolate-colored complexion. Terry lives in an old row house not far from Philadelphia's University area. The streets that cluster around the university campus form a somewhat integrated neighborhood, populated with working-class Black people and university students. A pedestrian bridge that crosses over a set of regional railroad tracks marks the neighborhood's edge. On the other side of the tracks is Terry's neighborhood. There, residents, from drug dealers to grandmothers, live in homes that often share a wall with abandoned or condemned houses. During most of the spring and summer months, the interior of Terry's home is completely dark. Besides shutting out the sun with shades and curtains, the family's only weapon against the summer's heat and humidity is a single-box fan. There is no central air conditioning system, which is considered a necessity in suburban homes outside of the city. The fan sits in the middle of the sparsely decorated front room. The room's other focal point is an 18-inch television set that seems to be on all the time. Terry lives with her mother's fiancé, a man with a peaceful presence and a face framed by the long beard favored by Muslim men, and a collection of real and adopted sisters. She has not seen her biological father, who is currently serving time in one of the state's prisons, in years. However, the man she refers to as her real dad, her mother's ex-boyfriend and the one who chose to be her father, remains a stable presence in her life. Terry's mother, who Terry considers a best friend, works 2 jobs and is home just 2 nights of the week. Terry is charged with taking care of her little sisters during the day. In addition, she plays the role of unofficial counselor on her block, listening and providing advice to most of the younger kids in the neighborhood when they come to her with questions and concerns. Terry and I spend most of our time talking on the covered porch outside her front door. It is here where I first meet Uncle Slim, another member of Terry's family. Slim is a rail-thin, dark-skinned man with a generous but toothless smile. He is, as I will learn firsthand, also a relentless flirt. Slim wears the same worn work clothes each time I see him. His worn blue jeans, worn white t-shirt, and worn construction boots hang loosely on his lanky body, which is also worn, it seems, by manual labor and cheap liquor. Slim steps onto the porch and greets Terry with a big hello and some good-natured teasing. He quickly casts his gaze on me. "Who are you?" he asks. Terry intercedes, explaining quickly that I am a lady who is talking with her about violence. "Oh, violence, huh?" Slim responds. "That's right," I confirm. "Oh, I'm violent," he says. "No, you're not," I joke. "You're a softie, I can tell." Slim's smile disappears. He begins to lift his right leg up, barely an inch off the floor, as he lowers his right hand into a small pocket on the side of his pants. He slowly draws his hand out, briefly revealing the handle of a knife in his leg pocket. As he continues the motion, he fully exposes the blade of a knife that was completely hidden just seconds before. Holding the handle of the knife, Slim stares directly into my eyes. I do not feel threatened, but I do get his message. If necessary, good-natured Slim can get down, and fast. Returning his gaze, I smile and let out a short laugh. He smiles and then releases a hearty laugh. He announces that he has to head to the corner store for some cat food and a 40-ounce bottle of malt liquor. After Slim leaves, Terry continues to introduce me to her neighborhood. Most residents seem to know and interact with one another on a regular basis. As Terry and I sit talking, 2 older women and 1 older man walk by. Terry acknowledges each person individually, by name, for example, "Hi, Mrs. Johnson," and each of her greetings is returned with a "Hi, sweetie." In between greetings, Terry's detailed report flows on. She covers the occupants, including the children, dogs, and cats, of almost every house on the block. When a young man wearing jeans, a sweatshirt with a white t-shirt that hangs to his mid-thigh, and construction boots walks by, staring into his cupped hands, Terry comments, "See that boy right there? He's a drug dealer. Look at him with all that money," she directs, as the young man flips through a clip of green bills. Terry has positive things to say about almost everyone in the neighborhood except the block captain, who has refused to open the fire hydrants on the hottest days of the summer, and the residents of a house around the corner. According to Terry, that house is a center for illegal activity, including drug selling and arbitrary violence. Terry says, "There's a house around the corner, with like 60 kids in it." 60? I question skeptically. No way. No, okay, not like 60. Like at least 15 to 18, and they sell everything there. The grandmom sells platters of food. They sell puppies. They sell drugs. And they have kids living there too. Terry tells me that one of the boys who lives in the house recently lured a cat down a closed alley. The boy then let his dog, a pit bull, follow the cat. After the pit bull attacked and ultimately devoured the cat, the boy had turned and shouted to the friend for whom he had staged this show, "See, I told you that my dog is on cats." Terry says that she later challenged this dog owner, demanding that he either train his dog or keep it off the street. The corner store boys. The corner at the other end of Terry's block is where the corner store boys hang out. Their name comes from the old storefront that marks the corner. This spot is a center of open-air drug trafficking, and much of the violent activity that occurs in the neighborhood takes place here. While the corner is relatively quiet during the day, by 6 p.m. activity picks up as the drug dealers go to work. Sometimes, Terry tells me, the little kids be hustling too. She quickly reels off the names of several people, with varying degrees of commitment to the corner's activities, who have been shot in recent years. Like many others in her neighborhood, Terry distinguishes between victims whose own actions put them in harm's way and those who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. She mourns for one young boy who was shot last year while just standing there. He wasn't even a drug dealer or anything. She is less sympathetic toward her own cousin. He was shot standing on the same corner, but, Terry explains, rolling her eyes, he is now back on the corner doing the same thing he was doing, selling drugs. Recent efforts to curb open-air drug trafficking in the city's neighborhoods have not had any effect where Terry lives. As she sees it, things are getting worse. There's more drug dealing on the block. Terry bases this conclusion on the number of new faces that have begun to appear on the corner. These people are strangers, she does not know them and has not even seen them before. Terry is now more careful to keep the younger kids in the neighborhood away from the corner once it gets dark. Doing so may protect them from some of the violence. Nonetheless, because so much legal and illegal activity is organized around the corner, violence can spill uninvited into the lives of everyone in the neighborhood, especially when the block gets hot and police surveillance and enforcement activities increase. The following excerpt from my field notes provides a sense of how such episodes unfold in the neighborhood. I drove to Terry's house today, and when I slowed my car to make a right onto Terry's block, I was blocked by a police officer standing in the middle of the street, with a police car on either side of him. The corner was full of young men, brown-skinned men, most in white t-shirts and baggy jeans. All of the young men stood around nervously. While none of them were in custody, all were aware that they were under surveillance, and perhaps most importantly, they were aware that they were not free to leave their corner just yet. Young women and men from the block gathered at a safe distance, across the street from the corner. There was little talking between neighbors and a lot of staring at the police officers, the police cars, and then back to the boys on the corner. When the police officer returns to his car, I am able to make a right onto Terry's block. I notice that neighbors are out of their homes and on their stoops, all eyes on the scene that I have left behind me. I quickly find a parking spot and join Terry's younger sister and best friend on Terry's stoop. As I approach the stoop, Terry's sister, who is as skinny as the iron railing she is dangling on while staring towards the corner, turns her head to smile at me, and then returns her stare to the corner. "What's going on down there?" I ask, mostly to the back of their heads. "It's getting hot," Terry's best friend explains. It is clear that she is not talking about the weather but commenting on the pressure felt by many residents when police activity in the neighborhood increases. "The cops chased that boy down the alley." "The boys on the corner?" I ask. Terry's best friend, demonstrating the appropriate wariness reserved for people who ask too many questions, simply repeats, "It's getting hot." When I return to my car moments later, two young boys between the ages of 6 and 7 whiz by on their kid-sized bicycles. A dark brown-skinned boy in jeans and a t-shirt wears a concerned look on his face. My brother got locked down? He is asking, as if to verify a piece of information given to him by his friend, who trails him by several strides. Yeah, his friend responds, breathing a bit more heavily. Your brother got locked down. He yells as the two young boys race with childlike urgency to the corner. When I finally catch up with Terry, she explains that there had been a shooting around the corner earlier in the day. Because of their ties to the corner, they, the corner store boys, all became suspects. It is through scenes like this that drug dealing, the various forms of violence associated with it, and the lessons of the code affect the daily lives of neighborhood residents. For younger residents, boys and girls, the local drug market and the related violence are stable features of neighborhood life, and the code of the street that governs this aspect of daily life is real. This is the context in which Terry has developed and sustained her reputation as a violent person, as she tells it. They all know me. Everybody around here knows me, Terry tells me as we sit on her porch. If you tell them that you know me, you cool. They all know me. So, I ask, if I get into some trouble around the neighborhood, then I can just tell them that I know Terry and I'll be cool. Yup, Terry replies confidently, leaning back in her folding chair as she takes in the view of the neighborhood. She is known on the block, and when she walks by the corner, the people hanging out there all say, "Hey, Terry." See, she confirms, they all know me. Everybody knows Terry because, after living in the neighborhood for 15 years, she has built a reputation as a violent person. Terry locates the origin of this identity in her very first fight, which took place in this same neighborhood nearly 12 years ago. The fight happened down the block from her house, next to what is now an abandoned lot, when Terry was 6 years old. She and her best friend were playing with two boys who were new to the neighborhood. Even at a young age, Terry was aware of how physical attributes sorted people, hierarchically, into appropriate categories. Terry had her young heart set on light-skinned and skinny Michael. Since Terry was also skinny back then, she decided that she should play with Michael, and her then chubby friend should play with Michael's friend, the chubby one. One day, as the four kids were playing, Terry's plan seemed to be going well. Michael had a pair of roller skates and had offered to let Terry use them after he was done. Terry happily accepted his offer, but then her best friend also asked to use the roller skates. Michael, oblivious to Terry's plan, agreed. Terry remembers being so angry at her girlfriend for disregarding an arrangement that seemed both right and settled to Terry. Michael was hers. She channeled her fury into her fists and fought her best friend. In her memory of this first fight, Terry was the winner. In the 12 years since this event, Terry has fought repeatedly, and with each victory she has strengthened her reputation as a young woman who can fight. The fights Terry gets into now are meant to protect that reputation and the authority and respect that enable her to navigate her neighborhood and the public high school she attends. Most of Terry's fights, now that she is in her late teens, occur at school. She describes a typical scenario, beginning with the initial, instigating event. One morning at school, one of Terry's female cousins approaches and informs her that another young woman at the school is stepping to her. Terry's cousin is likely to end up in a physical battle with this young woman unless someone intervenes. This is why the cousin comes to Terry and why Terry tracks down the adolescent girl who stepped to her cousin. She begins by talking with the girl. According to Terry, she and this young woman agree to squash the potential fight after Terry explains a simple truth: if the girl steps to Terry's cousin, she will also have to step to her. At this moment, in Terry's mind, the argument is settled. It has been ended by the strength of her intervention. However, later in the day, Terry's cousin reappears, reporting that the young woman has stepped to her again. Terry recognizes this action as a direct violation of the agreement reached earlier in the day. The fight, Terry stresses as she recounts the story, was supposed to be squashed. Therefore, the girl's latest action represents a flagrant sign of disrespect toward Terry. Essentially, she has called out Terry and now Terry must decide how she wants to respond. Terry chooses to publicly challenge the girl. She catches up with her in a school hallway. Other young people, who tend to gather quickly at the scene of any potential fight, promptly surround the two. As Terry turns to say something to a friend, her cousin sees that the young woman challenger has begun preparing for a fight. She has taken off her wig and is wrapping a scarf around her head to prevent the hair pulling that sometimes happens if a fair fight goes wild. "She's about to hit you," someone warns, calling out from the crowd. Recognizing that she will soon be at a disadvantage if she does not strike first, Terry turns around and punches the young woman in the face. As additional punches are thrown, the teenaged girl bites down on Terry's hand. Terry grabs the young woman's head with her other hand and leverages her own body weight to bang the girl's head into a vending machine. Blood spills from the woman's face and drips into the open wound on Terry's hand. School security guards finally reach the center of the fight and break it up. Terry is promptly suspended. She goes home concerned more over how best to deal with her mother's response to the suspension than over what to do about her obviously injured hand. She continues to ignore the gash until this area of her hand has doubled in size as the result of an infection. Terry finally visits the local hospital emergency room, where her infected wound is cleaned and stitched closed. As she remembers this visit, Terry rolls her eyes and tells me about a doctor who told her that she shouldn't be involved in that violent stuff. Terry is aware of the nonviolence rhetoric, she tells me. But in her neighborhood and in her school, it is preserving her reputation that matters most in protecting herself. It's not all about the boy. This need to maintain her reputation and the continuing significance of skin color among African American girls underlie a second and more protracted series of aggressive encounters that Terry describes to me. Light-skinned Alicia is a newcomer. She came to Terry's school earlier in the year. And while other young women warned Terry that Alicia was a man-eater, a young woman who is not to be trusted around anyone's boyfriend, Terry extended a welcome anyway. A week later, she had reason to regret her generosity. Alicia had begun flirting with Terry's not-quite ex-boyfriend. The stage for the first confrontation between the two teenaged girls is one of the most public places in the high school, the lunchroom. According to Terry, Alicia is the initiator. She interrupts a conversation Terry is having with her ex. Stepping past Terry, Alicia her face all up in his face and asks to borrow $1. To Terry, this act, played out in front of an audience, constitutes a pivotal point of disrespect and thus requires some form of response. Terry immediately challenges the young woman because, as she reminds me, I've got a reputation to maintain. After chastising her ex for allowing Alicia to interrupt their conversation, Terry follows the young woman into the hallway, where she proceeds to make a larger scene than the one Alicia initiated in the lunchroom. As an audience gathers, Terry explains to Alicia, and to everyone else within earshot, why she is about to beat her up. "First, I'm going to smack you for being all up in his face while I'm in there talking to him. Then, I'm going to beat you up because you know that was my man." Terry's threat complicates our understanding of what it means to fight over a boy. For Terry, the fight seems to be more about being disrespected than about the potential loss of a boy's affections, although the fact that the source of both the disrespect and the flirting was a light-skinned girl termed a man-eater likely heightened the intensity of her anger. Before the confrontation can escalate into a physical battle, however, a security guard forces the girls to leave the area and reminds Terry that if she fights again she will be expelled. Terry is aware of this constraint, and she was aware of it when she chose to call Alicia on her disrespectful behavior. But, as Terry said, she has a reputation to protect. The constraints within which Terry works as she upholds her reputation as a violent person are significant. She cannot allow the challenge from Alicia to go unmet, but at the same time, she must avoid being expelled from school. The rules, as Terry understands them, are simple. If she hits first, she will be expelled. So she does not hit first. Instead, each day, Terry bumps Alicia while she is walking down the school hallway, hoping that eventually this will provoke Alicia into hitting her. By Terry's logic, if Alicia hits her first, and all she, Terry, does is respond, purely in self-defense, she will not be expelled. Alicia, whose reputation is not defined primarily by her fighting ability, never does hit first. The school year ends with her still simply absorbing the blows from an individual who is widely acknowledged as a formidable challenger. Each time Alicia fails to respond, Terry's reputation is validated. Trade-offs. If Terry is, as she is reputed to be, a violent person, why doesn't she just fight Alicia and get expelled? The answer is relatively simple. Terry's identity as a violent person is not really who she is but rather a role she plays, a front that she has developed over time and now uses to facilitate her interaction with others as well as her movement through both her neighborhood and her school. To some, Terry is a ghetto chick, a woman who is not interested in or able to meet mainstream or local expectations regarding acceptable femininity. Yet, one would be incorrect to conclude that Terry is essentially a violent person or, in turn, essentially and irreformably ghetto. Irving Goffman's discussion of the presentation of self in everyday life is helpful in considering the performance Terry is deeply invested in. Goffman's explanation encourages us to consider Terry's story not as a story of a violent girl per se, but rather, as a story of how a teenaged girl embedded in the culture of the code may use a tough front and, at times, violence to negotiate for safety and respect in her everyday life. The maintenance of this front does not necessarily require continually engaging in physical fights. For example, Terry's victorious public and bloody hallway battle with the young woman who challenged her kept her reputation as a violent person intact for most of the school year. In the aftermath of that fight, new stories about Terry's fighting ability circulated throughout the school. She did not need to publicly reaffirm her reputation until a new member of the school community, Alicia, challenged her with a public display of disrespect. However, since Terry's reputation as a fighter is so strong and the constraints she is operating within so public, everyone knows that if she fights again she will be expelled. She does not actually have to fight Alicia. Rather, she simply has to make it clear that she is not letting Alicia get away with anything. Thus, she repeatedly tests Alicia, and her own reputation, through bumps in the hallway. The ongoing conflict with Alicia does not fully satisfy Terry's need to continually reaffirm her reputation, however. Occasionally, she sets up other school-based tests. For example, walking down a hallway, Terry came across two girls, at least juniors, she says, who were standing in a threatening position in front of another girl, who Terry thought was a freshman. It was clear to Terry that the two girls were preparing to fight this freshman girl, who had no backup in sight. The unfairness of this situation, she says, struck her as just not right. How are you just going to roll up on someone like that? Two girls and she by herself? She asks me. Terry stepped in front of the two girls and asked why they were messing with her little cousin. The duo quickly explained that they were tired of her little cousin's big mouth. Well, Terry retorted, maybe you have a big mouth. She made it clear that if the two young women had a problem with her little cousin, then they had a problem with her. Apparently not up to this challenge, the girls retreated promptly. Since this showdown, Terry's newly minted cousin, acutely aware of the protection she receives from her association with Terry, has repeatedly thanked Terry for coming to her aid. She also continues to trade on this association as she makes her own way through the school. Terry explains that whenever her cousin sees her in the crowded halls of the high school, she yells out, "Hey, Terry!" loud enough for everyone to hear. Terry laughs as she tells me this. Terry always says, "Hi back but," she confides, she still has no idea what that little girl's name is. Ultimately, the girl's name does not matter. Terry clearly derives a sense of power and self-confidence from intervening in an unfair situation and making it right simply through the strength of her own reputation. Perhaps most importantly, however, she has tested and validated her reputation once again, and she has managed to do so, once again, without having to fight, thus avoiding expulsion. After recreating this history of her violent and potentially violent interactions for me, Terry sits back on her folding chair, looks around, and then announces, "I'm a violent person." She pauses for a second and then says once more, "I'm a violent person." Recognizing that this sort of self-definition is insufficient, Terry searches for someone to validate her claim. Almost as though on cue, her 9-year-old sister leaps up the crumbling concrete porch steps. "Dana, ain't I a violent person?" Terry asks. Barely lifting her head, Dana lets out a quick, confirming yup and just as quickly bounds back down the porch steps. Terry's reputation, although cultivated mainly in the school setting, also helps to maintain her position in the neighborhood as a person of authority, someone everybody knows. Finally, as Terry sees it, keeping her reputation as a violent person believable means that she can continue, with little possibility of harassment, to do such atypical things as attend her advanced placement classes in chemistry and several other subjects, visit local colleges with other juniors who also have aspirations for higher education, and make plans to enroll in a summer program for gifted students at a local, predominantly white university. The future for girl fighters, unmaking meaning. After listening to their stories, I wondered what the future would look like for girls like Terry and Delisha. I did not wonder whether they would continue to struggle. The current conditions of inner-city life virtually guaranteed that they would, but would they always be fighters? The girls' stories suggested that sometimes a specific event or events, personal injury, extreme neighborhood violence, or perhaps a glimpse of a different, better set of life possibilities, would prompt a fighter to reconsider her commitment to this identity. Yet, these reconsiderations appeared to be momentary, and as fragile as they were fleeting. Each girl's movement toward a different self or her hope for a break from the struggle seemed to overlay a deeply rooted fear that to make such a move or to have such a hope was not only impractical but also foolish and, ultimately, dangerous. In order to truly pursue a different path, a girl fighter must disassociate herself from the identity she has so carefully crafted and loosen her commitment to the meaning embedded in the fight. Teenaged girls who are deeply invested in their fighter identity believe that they are fighting for something: status, respect, mobility, or freedom, qualities usually summed up as reputation. Much of their energy is given over to protecting their reputation, which is, both in their minds and in the culture of the code, integral to their struggle for survival. Of course, fighting and maintaining a reputation as a fighter require a great deal of physical and emotional energy. One has to be on and open to challenge all the time. Over time, girls, like their adolescent boy counterparts, can become exhausted by the everyday battles, physical and symbolic, that make up their struggle to survive. For some, this fatigue may prompt an interest in finding an opening, a pathway out of being a fighter. A hint that this fatigue has settled in lies in the meaning that inner-city, adolescent girls attach to their battles. For some, the fight goes from being about something very important to being about nothing, in Charmaine's words. Charmaine expressed her fatigue after her most recent fight with an adolescent boy. When I asked her what this fight had been about, she told me that it wasn't really over nothing. In contrast to the stories she told me about earlier fights, which had featured principled justifications for her actions, this fight narrative was empty. Charmaine's response was not much of a narrative at all. She did not set the stage and she provided no elaborate definition of the situation. The fight was just about nothing. In contrast, for Nneka, fighting is still meaningful. She continues to be deeply embedded in the rhetoric of respect, and the strength of her commitment is not shaken by either the actuality or possibility of injury. After the shooting happened, I didn't really change. I just had a wound on my face. I really didn't. I was still like. I didn't change, nothing really changed about me. Did you think, what if it wasn't a BB gun? What if it was something else? I ask. Nothing, she replies. Do you think that maybe some of these fights that you get into with this other young woman could ever end up badly? I ask. Nneka laughs. No, she says. Do you think anything can happen from it? No. Do you think you can actually lose the fight? I press. No. Nope. Unless somebody try and jump me, but that's not going to happen. Nneka is not wholly ignorant of the potential consequences associated with an ongoing commitment to the street. She knows that if you get into a fight, you can get beat up or hospitalized or locked up. She does not think any of these things will necessarily happen to her, however, and she remains hypersensitive to any signs of disrespect. She is still deeply committed to the fight for survival in its most literal sense. Each time I reviewed Nneka's sure response to my question about whether or not she could actually lose a fight, I found myself thinking about my conversation with Delisha. I could easily imagine Delisha giving me the same response if I had interviewed her 5 years earlier. But, As a young mother who has survived her share of real and symbolic challenges, Delisha's view of the future is not the same as Neka's. Her injury seems to have significantly affected her thinking about her life as a fighter. Usually, Delisha is on the winning side of fights with other girls. I was always doing the hurting to somebody, she tells me, reflecting on her history. I never cut nobody, never poked, stabbed, nobody or nothing. I always fought with my hands. But this is the first time something ever happened to me. And she was the reason I got cut. When I asked Delisha if this makes her feel different about fighting, she says, yeah. I ask why. It makes you feel like you never know what somebody's going to do because they are scared to fight you or they scared you're going to hurt them. So, you got to think about the odds and ends, when you're about to fight this person. Are they going to fight me fair or are they going to cut me, or are they going to do something to you, to hurt you? So, I've slowed down. Delisha's decision to slow down has also been influenced by the trauma of a recent mass murder in the area, which has cooled people out in the neighborhood, including her. The extreme violence of the massacre, combined with people just dying every day, people that we know, family members, all types of stuff, gives Delisha pause and makes her reconsider the violent interactions that are regularly played out on neighborhood streets. You don't ever know what people go through in their house. And then to go outside on the street and deal with the street problems too. It is in this last comment that I hear both Delisha's desire for a different world and her weathered realism that such a world does not yet exist. This is the dialectic that defines the struggle undertaken by young girls who live in neighborhoods like Delisha's. What about those girls who eventually leave these neighborhoods behind? What will become of those who manage to manipulate the code of the street in a way that allows them an opportunity to exit? What will girl fighters do in settings where violence is not a normal part of everyday life? Will they change? I cannot answer these questions with any certainty. The girl fighters' futures are no clearer to me than to them. Yet, girls' accounts reveal that context matters. Since much of their fighting behavior emerges from the pernicious circumstances in which they come of age, it's easy to imagine that this behavior would lessen in settings that ensured their safety and security. Indeed, there are hints in some girls' narratives that suggest the possibility of compromise and adaptation. Terry already suspects that fighting with looks, bumps, stares, or fists is not a part of the code at college. She tested this assumption after a recent tour of the campus of a local, predominantly white university. When the tour was over, Terry asked the guide, in the presence of other prospective students from similarly distressed neighborhoods who were part of the tour group, what would happen if someone was in the cafeteria and spilled Jell-O on someone else and that person got all hype, instigating a fight. Oh, the tour guide replied, everyone would just look at them like they were crazy. People don't do that here. Everyone's grown up. Of course, as Terry may one day discover, everyone who attends college is not grown up, but the circumstances of daily life on a university campus, even one located only blocks from her own neighborhood, make it not only possible but mandatory to establish and maintain a comfortable level of personal security without recourse to hands and fists. In making their way in the world outside the inner city, girls like Terry must step to completely different challenges, beginning with the daunting task of casting off their fighter identities.